Hello, in this video we discuss how web apps work. So you've all used web pages, and you've probably heard the term web application. What do we mean by web application? Well, basically a web application is just a web page that allows a user to interactively perform a particular task. So the difference here is really just interaction. We're also talking about mobile web apps. So what does it mean for something to be a mobile web app? A mobile web app is just a web app that's running in a browser on a mobile device. You access web apps using a web browser, but how does this information actually get there? Let's start out by assuming you're going to visit a website, such as google.com. Your browser first makes a request to get the content of this page. How does this happen? The internet, this fuzzy cloud in the middle, is a series of machines all connected together, and through this it needs to send the request and get back some information. It does this using a protocol known as HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is sort of the language that's spoken by browsers and web servers. This allows them to talk to each other. So you're in your browser and you've gone to visit google.com. What actually happens here is your browser makes a request to the server interprets that request and sends back a response, in this case the content of the page. Let's have a look at this process in a little more detail. It turns out that a web page isn't just a single HTML file that's returned by the server, but may be made up of lots of individual files. These could be simple things like images, for example the Google logo when you visit google.com, or other information like style sheets or JavaScript code that we'll concern ourselves with later in this unit. So the process here really is the browser makes an HTTP request, it receives back a response, and it interprets this. What it actually does is unpacks it and uses this to build an in-memory model of the page. This is what's known as the DOM. This is a structured representation of the page, and at this point it's going to notice that there's some things missing, that this page links with other content, for example the Google logo. What happens in this case is it makes further requests to request each of these files, and it'll get back another response for each of these requests that gives it that file. So it'll get one for the style sheet, one for the Google logo. And it uses this information to fill in the DOM. So this information then is put into the DOM and forms the complete representation of the page. Then what happens is the browser displays the DOM and you see the page in your web browser. This process of sending and receiving multiple requests and responses is the reason that sometimes when pages are loading on slow devices, you'll see things like the content relay out as the images arrive, or as a style sheet arrives and lets the browser know that the font should be a particular style of font. You might see a change in the way the page was initially laid out versus what it finally is once the page is fully loaded. On the server side, it's just going to receive HTTP requests, and for each one it sends back a response to the machine that made that request. In a simple case, the web server is going to be asked for an image file or something simple and static. In this case, it's just going to open that file off the disk and send it across the network back to the machine that made the request. The more complicated case is something like the Facebook timeline. Consider when you visit Facebook. Do you see the same content each time you visit it? No. The timeline is dynamic. You see something different every time you load Facebook. And indeed, each person, even if they visit at a particular time, gets a different response. They get back their own timeline rather than someone else's timeline. So what's happening here is the server is getting these requests and it's dynamically building the page that it's giving back as a response, and it's doing that from a database or some other data source. So let's assume this process is now finished and the web browser has sent the relevant requests and received the corresponding responses for all of the files that make up the entire web page that's being viewed. So what happens then? We basically have this process. On the left here are all of the things that make up the web page. We have the HTML, the structured description of the content of the page. We have CSS files that determine style and layout information, such as colors and font size and positioning of objects. We may have some number of images, and we may have some code that can control interactivity on the page. So this information, as I said, is interpreted by the browser. Basically, it's fed into a rendering engine. This rendering engine produces the DOM, this thing that we said it was filling in as it gets each of these individual files. And what the DOM is we describe it as a tree, and you can sort of think about it in terms of the code that you see at the top, or in terms of the drawing of the tree that you see at the bottom. It's a structured representation of the page. In this case, it says there's the document, and within the document there's some information about the page in a head element. Then there's the body of the page, and the body of the page is basically everything you see in the browser. That's what you're seeing here. And then within the body there's a paragraph, which is the first paragraph here. The second paragraph, that's here. An image tag, here's our image. A div tag, which is this section on the page here. And within this div tag there's more elements, a label, a text field, a button. And this is just a textual representation of that hierarchy that makes up the DOM. So you have the body, you have the first paragraph, you have the second paragraph, you have this div tag that we just talked about. You can see lines in the div tag for the label, the text field, and the button. Okay, this basically explains what happens for a static page, but what happens with an interactive page? So the browser has another component. It has a JavaScript engine. The input to this JavaScript engine obviously is the JavaScript file defined by the page. But the thing about this JavaScript engine is it can read, write, and rewrite the DOM. So it can make pretty much any change it wants to the DOM. It can insert new elements, it can remove elements, it can change things. And any of these changes that it makes to the DOM result in changes in the web page as you see it. So the JavaScript engine is incredibly powerful in that it has full control over what's displayed to you as the user. And the other input to this JavaScript engine is events caused by interaction by the user within their browser. So they might click an element, they might hover their mouse over something, and this information gets given to the JavaScript engine, and it can use it to change elements on the page. From this video, you should now have a pretty good idea of what happens behind the scenes when you're viewing a web page or using a web app. Thanks for watching.